You're watching JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. Welcome, friends. Jim Cantelon here. We are in Mark, and we are in Mark chapter 2. Going to begin with verse 23 here in a minute, with another, what we call Sabbath controversy. Jesus was continually being assailed by the religious authorities for his apparent disrespect for the Sabbath day. And this is a very key one here. We'll take our time with it, and I think we'll have a lot of application. So hang in. I'll be back right after this. Hi friends, Jim Cantelon here. I'm in Malawi in a very, very interesting setting where I am with a number of leaders who oversee various aspects of our partner ministry here called Somebody Cares. And I just might read some of what they represent. We have leaders here who are involved with youth, some with safe motherhood, others with granny's care, some in the health sector, some in the education sector, some in the legal sector, believe it or not, almost acting as paralegals, some as administrators, village pastors, and chiefs. And I have the great privilege of spending 2 or 3 hours with them, just taking them through some of the strong biblical principles that are, if you will, the infrastructure of the ministry of Somebody Cares. And so here they are. These are key leaders, chosen leaders, and they're all here to praise the Lord. Now we're going to look at these Sabbath controversies, but before we do, just a few comments about the idea of Sabbath. In the Hebrew language, it's Shabbat. Basically, it's the seventh day. And of course, in Israel, where we lived for 7 years, it took us a while to learn this, but Saturday is the holy day, not Sunday. It's the seventh day. It's the day of rest, Shabbat. And I'll talk about that as we go through this next section, but Sabbath comes from Shabbat. And what has happened here for most of the Christian world is that we have transferred the Shabbat concept to Sunday as the Lord's Day. But in Israel, where we learned a whole new culture and a whole new language and a whole new way of living, Yom Rishon, which means day the first, is Sunday, and it is the first work day of the week. So it took us a while when we moved there back in 1981 to adjust to that new reality. Everything shuts down on Shabbat. No restaurants open, no buses running. It's like the city just kind of exhales and truly rests. You know, it really is a day of rest in Israel. Okay, let's pick up verse 23 here of Mark chapter 2. One Shabbat, or one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God, ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" There's nothing perhaps that separates Jew from Gentile more than the observance of the Sabbath. It really stands apart, and it's arguably the most valuable of all Jewish traditions because it's a weekly thing. It's a weekly time to remember the Creator. And it's not to be taken lightly by Christians, nor is it to be dismissed as an irrelevance. Personally, I grew to love it. When I and my family lived in Jerusalem for those 7 years, I can fully appreciate and why Orthodox Jews throughout the centuries have called it Queen Shabbat. Her entrance every Friday at sundown brings its own special presence. Peace, love, family, scripture, ritual, food, sweet rest. For a survival culture, it provides an earthly refuge. I think, reminding me at least of Psalm 91, verses 1 and 2. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress. My God, in Him I will trust. At dusk, the Queen arrives, Friday night, and her shadow envelops the observant Jewish family in the secret place of the Most High. Really, in many ways, and I mean this, Shabbat in the Jewish world is a work of living art. I've, in 7 years of living in Israel, Kathy and I and our 3 kids had a lot of Israeli friends, of course. And we were invited many, many times to the Sabbath meal. It's called Kabbalat Shabbat, welcoming the Sabbath. It's a beautiful, sacred moment. We sit at the table, and the oldest, the father, would stand up at the end of the table and hold up the bread and the wine. And he would hold up the bread first of all and say, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." And he would break it and hand it, and people would break it and go right around the table and would all wait with their bread. And then he'd say, "Blessed art thou, Lord of the universe, who brings forth fruit from the vine." And everyone would have some wine with their broken bread. And this, of course, to me, as I see it, was what Jesus was getting at when in the upper room, just before he died, he had what we now call the Last Supper. As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you to show forth my death until I come. Jesus wanted to be remembered. And the best way to be remembered was to take this weekly observance of Kabbalat Shabbat, the broken bread and the spilled wine, or the poured wine, I should say, as trigger mechanisms for memory. When you read the Old Testament, or Tanakh, as it's called in Israel, time and time again, God's issue with the children of Israel was they forgot him. And if there's one thing God just cannot abide, it's being forgotten. And I see the same thing, in God the Son, in Jesus. He did not want to be forgotten. He wanted to be remembered. And so this beautiful, Seder, which happens once a year, but it really reflects the weekly Shabbat meal, was a key player, I think, in the sustainability of Christian faith throughout the centuries. The Eucharist, as we call it, is central. It's a sacrament, if you will, in the Christian's life. Now, the risk here with Shabbat is to romanticize it or to legalize it. And in this passage, Jesus teaches us to avoid both of these polarities. The Sabbath is not about a day. It's about us. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, Jesus says. Interestingly, the word Shabbat basically means cessation or desistance. Cessation? Yeah, cessation from work. Cessation of the stress of your weekly life. A day to just kind of kick back and just forget about all of that stuff and just be the marvelous creature that you've been made in the image of God. Physical labor is taboo. It's a day for quieting the heart. But let's get this straight. According to Jesus, it's about the heart, not the day. Critical. And if we want to dispute it, we should do so with one another, but not with Jesus. He is Lord of the Sabbath, and what he says about the Sabbath goes. And this is the first instance that I've seen in the Gospels where Jesus, if you will, in your face pulls rank. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. If I say this is the case, this is the case. Of course, this would only offend, the Pharisees who were finding fault with him. But there you have it. Okay, let's pick it up in chapter 3. Verse 1. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger, and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Whoa. This is another Sabbath controversy, So whether it's picking heads of grain, a no-no, to legalistic Pharisees, or healing a man with a shriveled hand on the Sabbath, Jesus was offending because of his disrespect for the holy day. Jesus sees relative worth of the day in terms of doing good and not evil. Saving a life on Sabbath trumps any legalistic prescription of the labor involved, and even the most legalistic Pharisees would have to admit that. There's so much in a book called the Talmud, which is a critical interpretation of the Mishnah, which was an original writing of the oral law of the Jewish faith centuries and centuries and centuries past. But there's whole sections there in the Talmud about what you can and cannot do on Sabbath. But when it comes to saving a life, it comes to saving say your sheep that's fallen into a pit, of course you got to save it, even though there's work involved. So even they would admit this. And so when Jesus asked them the question whether it's good, whether it's a Sabbath, a day for doing good or doing evil, they kept silent because they knew the answer. Of course, if you're going to do good, then yeah, I guess. The greater the day, the greater the good, as far as Jesus is concerned. His healing of this man with the shriveled hand raised the bile of the Pharisees to a fever pitch. They became irrationally angry to the point of plotting with their arch enemies, the Herodians, the ruling party of Rome, to kill Jesus. Imagine. The Pharisees hated the Herodians hated the Pharisees, but on Jesus, they came together. He brought enemies into unity for the purpose of killing him. He was tying them in knots, and they couldn't take it anymore. It escaped them that plotting a death, of course, was a very un-Sabbath thing to do. Amazing how we don't see ourselves, huh? We can look at the other person, and say, you got a piece of sawdust in your eye. And Jesus says, really, good for you. Did you not know that you've got a log in your own eye? Jesus used hyperbole, exaggeration for the sake of emphasis, time and time again in his teaching. But the point is this, that sometimes even as we accuse others, we're essentially accusing ourselves because we see our agendas, our bent motives, our sinful nature in the other guy. And in condemning it in the other guy, we're somehow condemning ourselves and finding some kind of atonement in that very unusual process. In my book, Cantelon's Casual Commentary, which is available, by the way, if you just type it into your Google search, Cantelon's Casual Commentary, you'll find it. Most bookstores out there are making it available, online bookstores, that is. And I think you'd enjoy it. I go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John, just like I'm doing here in the show, only in greater detail. And it's a good way to fill in some of the blanks. Anyway, in the book, when I get to this section here, in chapter 3, verse 7 of Mark, my headline is Jesus the Rock Star. Rock star. Of course, in our culture, that's a description of someone who is wildly popular. And for sure, Jesus was that. He was a celebrity, the likes of which the people had never seen before. It's amazing how quickly the word gets out. You go to this guy, he heals you. It doesn't matter what your sickness is, whether it's leprosy, whether it's blindness, whether it's deafness, whether it's lameness. He even raises the dead. People flocked to him in their thousands. On one occasion, he had as many as 50,000 people following him around, drawing huge crowds. Some of these people would walk miles, some even days, just to see him, to get near him. Often they would find him teaching at the Sea of Galilee, or as the Israelis call it, Kinneret, which means harp. And they would crowd into the point where he was being pushed into the lake by the crowd. And so what he would do is he would get in one of his disciples' boats and just get out from the shore a bit, anchor, and he would sit in the boat and he would teach from the boat. And I say sit because that's what rabbis did in those days. They sat to teach. Very, very seldom that a rabbi would stand in a synagogue to preach. Today, of course, we're used to clergymen standing in a pulpit, but that was not the norm in Jesus' day. Nevertheless, preaching from this little boat, I'm reading this and thinking about one of my favorite novels, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which is an amazing novel. If you haven't read it, it's worth the read. Next time you're on holidays, find a copy of Moby Dick. It's not easy reading, but it is profound reading, and it is huge. Anyway, at one point, one of his main characters is on shore, and he goes into this little seaside chapel. And in the chapel, just a few pews, there's this huge pulpit. And this is how Herman Melville describes it. Its paneled front was in the likeness of a ship's bluff bows, and the Holy Bible rested on a project piece of scrollwork, fashioned after a ship's fiddle-headed beak. What could be more full of meaning? For the pulpit is ever this earth's foremost part, and the rest comes in its rear. The pulpit leads the world. From thence it is the God of breezes fair and foul, who is first invoked for favorable winds. Yes, the world's a ship on its passage out, and not a voyage complete, and the pulpit is its prow. I just love that passage. So, Jesus preached from the prow of his little ship. He healed the sick. He delivered the spiritually oppressed. And while those who were healed wondered and wept with joy, impure spirits cried out, "You are the Son of God." This is interesting. The first out there statements of who Jesus was came not from the people, but from the dark side, came from the pit of hell itself. We know who you are. You are the Son of God. But the profound truth from the gates of hell itself swept over the heads of the people. The kingdom of heaven had little draw for them. They were living in the here and now, and they just wanted their current needs met. The big picture needs, I just need this broken leg healed. I just need my heart healed. Whatever. Verse 13 of Mark 3. Where am I? Here I am. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter; James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder; Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. To this point in Mark's narrative, he's identified 5 men called by Jesus to follow him. He's identified Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Levi. On a mountainside into the hills, as the Bible says, he called 7 more. The full name, again, the full 12, I've just read it, I'll read it again. Simon Peter, James and John, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew or Levi, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot. He chooses them with purpose. They're to be sent out to preach and to do spiritual battle. And apart from the betrayer, Judas, who committed suicide eventually, they would all suffer death in the pursuit of their high calling. At this point, however, they had no idea what awaited them. Now, let me just get back to these names for a minute. Simon Peter, James, John, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot. You don't hear much about James, the son of Alphaeus. You don't hear much about Thaddeus. You don't hear much about Simon the Zealot. You don't hear much about Bartholomew. It's the other guys. But nevertheless, these men for whom, the gospel record is silent, nevertheless were keenly and carefully chosen by Jesus, and no doubt had a huge impact in the world after the resurrection. So there you have it. Now, these were the men who would be the 12, as they're called. Peter, James, and John were the 3. And there was an interesting dynamic as Jesus' ministry unfolds here, because it seems that Jesus confides more in the 3 than he does in the 12. But the 12 are very much, a part of everything. The 3 are part of the 12, of course. But then there were about 120 others who were pretty much consistently a part of the entourage, if you will, that followed Jesus from place to place. At one point, Jesus sends out the 120 to do ministry, okay? So you've got the 12, you've got the 3, you've got the 120. But then added to that, you have the support group, if you will, the ground crew. I mean, this was like a moving village, this group of people. There had to be food, there had to be bedding, there had to be tents, there had to be any number of just day-to-day necessary items. And there were those who made sure that these things happened. A lot of them were women who provided the needs for Jesus and the disciples in terms of their food and their clothing and some of their other issues related to day-to-day life. This was a big group. So, when you think about disciples, you have to understand, yes, there were 12, but then there were that inside 3, special, Peter, James, and John. Then there were the 120, and then there were the hangers-on and the support group, many of them, I'm sure, with donkeys and mules carrying a lot of the luggage that such a large group required. And so it was a big group. There would be a group dynamic, of course. And it's interesting that Mark and the other gospel writers don't say too much about the social interaction, within these few hundreds of people who were following Jesus around. But you can be sure there was. And I suspect, and I point this out in my book, Cantelon's Casual Commentary, that especially in those moments like the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus took Peter, James, and John up to the top or somewhere along the side of Mount Hermon, and there had this transfiguration event. Those who stayed at the bottom of the mountain waiting for them, I think were a touch resentful that these 3 had been chosen for this special moment, to the point that as they're walking back to Capernaum from Mount Hermon, and it's a long way down from Mount Hermon down to Capernaum, from about 12,000 feet down to 400 feet below sea level, they began to discuss, well, then who's the greatest? I mean, Jesus is obviously showing some favoritism here. What's up with this? And Even, James and John got in on it, even though they were part of that inside three, to the point where they get their mother in one instance to lobby with Jesus to see who of her sons will sit on the right and who will sit on the left when he establishes his throne in Jerusalem. In other words, who will be his prime minister? Who will be his president? Human beings. They all had agendas. Do you have an agenda? Do I have an agenda? Well, the answer, of course, is most of the time we do. Hopefully, the agenda doesn't dominate our lives. I hope it's Jesus and his presence that dominates our lives. I'll be back right after this.
Wow! Working for Orphans and Widows has been caring for orphans and widows in Africa and India for over 20 years. Key to its vision is partnership with local champions who engage hundreds of church-based volunteers in home-based care. Care for the sick and the dying in their own humble homes. They are defenseless and afflicted. They are the least of these that Jesus would have us love and care for. Our partnered champions are based in South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and India. They provide faithful, accountable, and godly care for thousands. Together with WOW, they truly are the hands and feet of Jesus to the sick and the dying. Founder and president Jim Cantelon has been committed to both teaching the gospel via Jim Cantelon Today TV and practicing the gospel through WOW. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
So, friends, those of us who are Christians are Christ followers. We're disciples. And even though we're not walking with Jesus physically through the Upper Galilee and the Lower Galilee and into Jerusalem and hearing him preach one-on-one, sometimes one to thousands, we nevertheless look to him as our example, our leader, our friend, and ultimately as our Savior. Being a Christian is not just saying, I believe. Being a Christian means I follow. And what Jesus does and teaches, I try to do, I try to live, and to my best ability, I put myself in his hands. And I dutifully put my hand in his and walk in his shadow. That's what it means to be a Christian. Thanks for watching, friends. See you again next time. Bye for now.